Hello, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Tonight, we're going somewhere small and quiet, behind the baseboard of an old townhouse in the village of Fernhollow, where 5 tiny creatures called the Tidwells are about to begin their night. The shop below is closed. The herbs are resting in their jars, and upstairs, Ada has finally put down her pen and gone to bed. Whatever today was, leave it where it is. We're not going back to it tonight. Notice where you are right now. Your head on the pillow, your body supported. Comfortable enough is exactly where we start. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Not forced, just resting. Let your face ease, your forehead, your jaw, the space behind your eyes. Think of a small, warm room. Walls of old wood, a single candle burning on a shelf, the smell of chamomile and something faintly earthy, like the inside of a drawer that has held good things for a very long time. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the width of your back against the mattress. Let your arms lie where they are. Your hands can stop holding on to anything now. Behind the baseboard, the Tidwells are gathering. Moss is on his stool. Willa has set her sewing aside. Wren is standing near the gap, listening to the house. Lark is thinking about something. Lark is always thinking about something. And Tuck is sitting cross-legged on the floor, waiting, with the particular patience of someone who knows that something good is about to happen. Your legs are heavy now. Your feet can be still. Outside, Fernhollow is settling into the dark. The lane is quiet. The shop windows are black. The old oak on the village green stands in the moonlight, and somewhere a clock is about to strike 12. The Tidwells are ready. Very gently now. Let's go and see how the night begins. The shelf above Ada's kitchen sink had been leaning since Thursday. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch the eye from across the room, or make anyone stop in the doorway and think, that needs attention. It was a subtle thing, the kind of lean that happened so gradually that the eye adjusted to it without registering the adjustment. The way you stop hearing a clock after the first few minutes, even though it has not stopped ticking. The left bracket had worked itself loose from the wall, one screw still holding, the other sitting in its hole with nothing left to grip. And the shelf had settled into a new angle, perhaps 3 degrees from level, perhaps 4, enough that the 7 small glass jars sitting on it had shifted, enough that the jar at the far left end was sitting with perhaps a quarter of its base over nothing at all. Lark had seen it at dusk, had watched it for a long time, the way Lark watched things, not anxiously, but with the focused patience of someone working something out. The jar at the end had not moved in the time Lark was watching, but the shelf had a particular quality to it, a held breath quality, the quality of something that had been patient for as long as it intended to be patient, and was now simply waiting for the right moment. Lark had gone back through the gap and told the others. Wren had asked 3 questions in quick succession. How many jars? What was in them? How far over the edge was the end one? And Lark had answered all 3 carefully. Moss had listened without asking anything. Willa had looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was her way of looking at something that was not in the room. And Tuck had immediately said, "I can carry the jars." "We will see," said Wren. "I carried the button last week." The button was not full of dried lavender. Tuck considered this. How heavy is dried lavender? "Heavy enough," said Wren. The clock in the sitting room struck 11, and the house began its settling. They could hear Ada's footsteps moving through the bedroom, the familiar pattern of them, the particular rhythm of her evenings, the creak of the wardrobe door, the sound of water running briefly in the bathroom, the soft knock of something set down on the bedside table, her glass of water perhaps, or the small pot of hand cream she kept there. Then the long creak of the floorboard beside her bed. Then the click of the lamp. Then the house. Just the house, breathing around them in the dark. Willa set aside the length of cord she had been working with. She was making something from it, though she had not said what, and nobody had asked, because Willa's making was Willa's business, until it was ready to be anyone else's, and stood and smoothed the front of her clothing and adjusted her red scarf. "Come then," she said. They gathered at the entrance gap. The arrangement of them, the same as always. Willa at the front, Moss to her left, Wren to her right, Lark and Tuck just behind. Tuck stood very straight. Tuck always stood very straight for this part, as if the straightness itself were a form of readiness. Willa folded her hands. "Never let a human see you clearly," she said. The words even and unhurried, worn smooth with use. Never leave the building before the 3rd year. Never wake a sleeping human. Tuck mouthed along. The pause before clearly was closer tonight, almost in the right place. Almost. Willa looked at each of them. then the small nod. They waited. The clock began. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Lark counted under the breath. Tuck counted on fingers, ran out at 10, started again on the same fingers without any sign of embarrassment. The last note faded. Wren went first, then Lark, then Tuck, sideways with dignity, then Willa, then Moss, pulling the covering back into place behind him. The quiet click of it, the habit of it, the same every night. The kitchen was cold tonight, colder than it had been. There was a particular quality to the air that came in under the back door on nights when the temperature outside had dropped sharply. A thin cold that moved along the floor and found the ankles and the backs of the hands. The heating had been off for longer than usual. Ada had gone to bed earlier, which meant the kitchen had been cooling for longer, and the stone flags held the cold the way they held everything, completely, without apology. They stood at the baseboard edge and let the room come to them. The shelf above the sink was visible from here, just a dark line against the slightly lighter dark of the wall. The 7 jars sitting on it in a row. The end one with its quarter base overhang that Lark had described. From this distance, it looked stable enough. From this distance, most things looked stable enough. That was the thing about distance. Ada's kitchen was different tonight in other ways too. The worktop was clearer than usual. The botanical sketches put away. The rose hips jar moved to the windowsill. The river stone sitting alone near the back edge of the worktop, as if Ada had picked it up and held it for a while, and set it down somewhere slightly different without noticing. Her apron was not on the back of the door. It was folded on the chair instead, folded with some care, which was unusual. Ada generally hung things rather than folded them. Willa noticed this and said nothing, but her eyes stayed on the folded apron for a moment longer than they needed to. The mug on the table had been rinsed tonight. It sat upside down on the draining board beside the sink, still slightly damp. A small pool of water beneath it on the wooden draining board. Ada had washed up before bed. She did not always. Tonight she had. "She is tired," said Willa quietly. Not sadly, just noting it. "How can you tell?" said Lark. She washed the mug. When she is very tired, she does small things that do not need doing yet. It is a way of feeling finished. Lark looked at the upturned mug on the draining board. That is a very particular thing to know about someone. You learn people, said Willa, by watching what they do when they think no one is watching. They crossed the kitchen floor. The cold came up through the stone flags into the soles of their feet. A clean cold, not unpleasant, the kind that made you aware of the warmth you were carrying inside you. Moss moved steadily, his breath just barely visible in the cold air, a faint ghost of it. Wren moved efficiently, her eyes on the shelf above the sink, already assessing. Lark moved in the slight arc toward the worktop out of habit, then corrected, remembering there was nothing to look at there tonight. Willa walked with her hands clasped behind her back, reading the floor. Tuck moved fastest, as always, and arrived at the base of the kitchen cabinet below the sink first, and stood looking up at the shelf with both hands on hips. The shelf was higher than it had looked from across the room. It is very high, Tuck said. Yes, said Wren. How do we get up there? Wren was already looking at the cabinet below the shelf. The doors of it, the slight gap between them, the small lip of the worktop edge above. The cabinet door has a hinge, she said. The hinge has a ridge. We can use the ridge. Moss was looking at the bracket. From below, the loose one was visible, the screw sitting in its hole, the bracket pulled slightly away from the wall, a thin gap of shadow between the metal and the plaster. He could see exactly what had happened. The screw had been the wrong size for the hole to begin with, too narrow, relying on friction rather than grip. And over time, with the small daily vibrations of a kitchen in use, the friction had given up. It had not given up all at once. It had given up gradually, the way most things did. The bracket first, Moss said, before the jars. If we move the jars and the bracket goes, the shelf goes with them. Wren looked at him. Can you fix the bracket tonight? Moss looked at the bracket for a moment, at the screw in its hole, at the gap between the metal and the plaster. He reached into the loop on his belt and took out his tool. The wire bent at one end, the leather grip, and turned it once in his hand. I can make it hold, he said. Properly fixing it needs a different screw, but I can make it hold until she notices and does it herself. How long will it hold? Long enough, said Moss, which was, for Moss, a complete answer. Getting up to the shelf required all of them working in sequence, which was the kind of problem Wren was best at. The spatial problem. The question of who goes where and in what order, and what each person does while the others are doing their part. The cabinet door hinge gave them the first foothold. Wren went up first, testing the ridge of the hinge with her weight before committing to it, then pulling up to the worktop edge, and from there to the top of the cabinet, which was a flat surface thick with the particular dust that accumulates on top of things that are never looked at. A soft gray dust, undisturbed, that compressed slightly under their feet like the finest possible carpet. She reached back down for Tuck. Tuck grabbed her hand and was pulled up with a small grunt of effort and stood on the worktop, looking at the dust with great interest. "It is very soft," Tuck said. "Don't," said Wren. Tuck had been about to sit in it, reconsidered, stood very still instead, which required some effort. Lark came up next, then Willa, then Moss last, slower than the others, taking his time with the hinge ridge, his tool tucked safely in his belt. When he reached the top of the cabinet, he stood for a moment and looked at the shelf from this new angle, level with it now, the bracket visible in detail, the jars close enough to see the labels Ada had written on them in her fine, careful hand. 7 jars, each one stopped with a cork, each one labeled in dark blue ink, the same ink that had been on its side on the kitchen floor the night before, now standing upright in its bottle on the table below. The labels read, from left to right, chamomile, lavender, rose, lemon balm, valerian, passion flower, meadow sweet. Lark read them slowly, then read them again. "They are all for sleep," Lark said. "Or for calm," said Willa, "which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes different. She has a whole shelf of them." "She has a whole shop of them," said Willa, "but these are the ones she keeps close." Lark looked at the jar at the end, the meadow sweet, the one with a quarter of its base over nothing, the one that had been waiting. "Of course it is that one," Lark said quietly. Said Willa. Moss went to the bracket first. He crouched beside it on the top of the cabinet, his face close to the wall, and examined the screw in its hole with the careful attention he gave to all broken things. Not frustrated by the breaking, not impatient with it, simply interested in understanding exactly what had happened and what could be done about it. The hole was slightly too wide. The screw had been turning in it for some time, finding less and less to grip, until it had stopped turning altogether and simply sat there, held by nothing much. Moss pressed the bracket back against the wall with one hand and felt the resistance of it, the slight spring in the metal, the way it wanted to pull away again the moment he released the pressure. He took his tool from his belt and worked the tip of it into the gap between the screw head and the bracket, feeling for the thread of the screw, the angle of it. Then he began to work, slowly, methodically, small movements, each one deliberate, each one building on the last. The sound of it was very quiet, a faint metallic whisper, barely audible, the kind of sound that existed at the very edge of hearing and would not have registered to anyone not specifically listening for it. Tuck had come to stand beside him, not to help. Tuck understood, without being told, that this particular work needed only one pair of hands, but to watch. Tuck watched Moss work the way Tuck watched most things that Moss did, with complete attention, storing it away somewhere for later. "What are you doing exactly?" Tuck said, quietly. The kitchen voice, the one they all used out here. "Packing the hole," said Moss. He did not stop working as he spoke. "The hole is too wide for the screw, so I am making it narrower." "How?" "With this." He indicated the tip of his tool, which had gathered a small amount of something from the gap. A compressed fiber, barely visible. "There is old plaster dust in the gap, compacted. I am pressing it back around the thread of the screw. It will not hold forever, but it will hold." Tuck watched this for a moment. "That is very clever." "It is very old," said Moss. "Someone knew it before I did." "Who taught you?" Moss was quiet for a moment. His hands kept moving, small and steady. "My grandfather," he said, "who learned it from his." Tuck absorbed this. The idea of knowledge passing through hands, generation to generation, arriving here in this cold kitchen above a herbalist shop in Fernhollow at midnight, in the hands of someone 3 inches tall, working on a shelf bracket by candlelight. "Will you teach me?" Tuck said. "When your hands are ready," said Moss. "Are they not ready now?" Moss glanced at Tuck's hands. Small, even by Tidwell standards. The hands of someone who had not yet done enough to know what they could do. "Not yet," he said. "But soon." Tuck looked at the hands in question, turned them over, considered them seriously, then looked back at Moss working, and went back to watching. While Moss worked on the bracket, Wren organized the jars. The plan was straightforward. Move each jar back from the edge, redistributing the weight more evenly across the shelf, with the heaviest ones toward the center, where the remaining good bracket was. Wren had assessed the weight of each jar by pressing her palm against the glass and feeling the density of what was inside. Dried flowers were lighter than they looked. Dried roots were heavier. The valerian jar, valerian being a root, was the heaviest of the 7, and was currently sitting third from the left, which was not where it should be. "Lark," said Wren. "Valerian. Center." Lark came to the valerian jar and put both hands against it. It was perhaps twice Lark's height, the jar, wide-bodied and heavy. "It is not going to move easily." "It does not need to move far, just to the center. The center is 4 jar widths away. Then we move it 4 jar widths." Lark looked at the jar. The jar did not look back, being a jar, but it had a certain quality of solidity that Lark found mildly challenging. "Willa," Lark said, "will you take the other side?" Willa came and placed her hands on the far side of the jar. They looked at each other across the top of it. "Slowly," said Willa. "I know," said Lark. "I am saying it anyway." They moved the valerian jar. It was heavy, and the shelf was not entirely level, and the movement required more effort than it looked like it should. A sustained push that engaged the whole body. Feet planted, weight forward. The jar moved in small increments. An inch. A pause. Another inch. A pause. The glass making a faint grinding sound against the shelf wood that made everyone stop and listen to the house each time it happened. The house was still. Ada slept. They moved it to the center. Wren looked at it, pressed it lightly from the front to check its stability, nodded once. "The meadow sweet," she said. "Lark." Lark went to the end of the shelf. The meadowsweet jar was the smallest of the 7, a narrow jar, taller than it was wide. The dried flower clusters inside it, pale and feathery, pressing against the glass. And it was sitting with a quarter of its base over the edge of the shelf, exactly as described. The overhang so matter-of-fact about itself that it was almost difficult to believe it had not always been that way. Lark put both hands on it very carefully, felt the slight instability of it, the way the weight of it was distributed unevenly. The glass cool and smooth under the palms. "Tuck," said Lark. Tuck appeared immediately. "Yes." "Stand behind me. If I tell you to push, push toward the wall. Not hard, just firmly." Tuck positioned behind Lark, both hands ready. "Ready?" "Wren," said Lark, "watch the shelf. If it moves—" "I am watching," said Wren. Lark began to draw the meadowsweet jar back from the edge, slowly, the base of it scraping very gently against the shelf wood. A sound like a whisper, like something being said very quietly in another room. The overhang reduced. A quarter, then an eighth, then nothing. The whole base of the jar on the shelf, and Lark kept drawing it back until it was a full jar width from the edge, and stopped. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Tuck exhaled. A small sound, barely anything, but it said everything about the last 30 seconds. "Good," said Wren. "It was very close," said Lark. "It was," said Wren. "It was very close." They looked at the jar, sitting safely on the shelf, a full jar width from the edge. The pale meadowsweet flowers pressing against the glass, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened, as if they had always been exactly here. Moss finished with the bracket as they were repositioning the last 2 jars. The chamomile moved slightly left. The passion flower moved slightly right. The weight of the shelf now distributed with the kind of quiet logic that would not be visible to anyone looking at it, but would be felt, in the way that correctly balanced things are always felt, even when they are not consciously noticed. He pressed the bracket against the wall one final time and held it there for a moment, feeling the resistance of it. Less spring now, the screw sitting more firmly in its packed hole, the bracket flush against the plaster. "It will hold," he said. "How long?" said Wren. "Until she looks at it properly. Which she will. She notices things." Wren looked at the bracket, at the shelf, at the 7 jars sitting in their new arrangement, the valerian in the center, the meadowsweet a safe distance from the edge. "She will not know why it feels different," she said. "No," said Moss, "but it will feel different. Is that enough?" Moss put his tool back in his belt. "It is always enough," he said. They made their way back down from the cabinet. Moss first this time, then Willa, then Lark, then Wren, then Tuck last, lowered carefully by Wren's hand to the hinge ridge, and from there to the floor. Tuck landed with a small sound, and straightened up and looked back up at the shelf. The 7 jars sat in their row. The shelf sat at its slight angle, 3 degrees, perhaps 4. But the bracket held, and the jars were back from the edge, and the meadowsweet was safe, and the kitchen was exactly as Ada had left it, except for the things that mattered, which were different now, in ways she would not be able to name. Tuck looked at the meadowsweet jar for a long moment. "She drew it," Tuck said. "Last night. Lark said she drew it." "She did," said Lark. "So she cares about it particularly." "I think so." Tuck nodded slowly. "Good," Tuck said. "Then it is good that it did not fall." Nobody disagreed with this. It was a simple thing, and it was true, and there was nothing to add to it. They crossed back to the baseboard in the cold kitchen, their breath just barely visible in the air, the stone flags cold beneath their feet. Wren counted them at the gap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they went through one by one, moss last, the covering back into place, the quiet click of it. The home was warm after the cold of the kitchen. The candle had burned lower, the flame smaller now. The circle of light it threw tighter and more amber. The smell of chamomile and old wood, and the faint resinous smell from Moss's earlier work. The low ceiling, the shelves, the acorn-capped bowls, the cork stopper, the length of cord Willa had been working with, coiled now on the shelf beside her sewing. Willa went to the highest shelf and took down the thimble. Tonight, Ada had left a good amount, a full cup of chamomile made and barely touched, sat on the kitchen table and forgotten when something in her sketchbook had caught her attention. The tea going cold and untouched while Ada drew. Willa had collected it before they went out, warmed it in the copper button back over the candle flame, watching the surface of it carefully, and poured it into the thimble until it was full to the rim, and a single drop ran down the outside of the brass and was absorbed into the wood of the shelf. She set it in the center of the floor. The steam rose from it in a slow, unhurried curl, thicker than last night. The chamomile smell strong and warm and very present in the small room. They settled around it. The same arrangement, the same particular spots, the same way of sitting that had established itself without discussion and would not change. Moss on his stool, Willa beside him, legs folded, scarf ends in her lap. Wren against the wall, knees up. Lark cross-legged, leaning forward. Tuck pressed against Wren's side, one hand on Wren's knee, the folded cloth already around the small shoulders before anyone had thought to reach for it. The candle burned. The thimble steamed. Tuck looked at the thimble for a moment, then at Wren. "I helped," Tuck said. "You did," said Wren, "with the meadowsweet jar. Lark said to push, and I was ready to push." "You were ready," said Wren. "I did not need to push in the end." "No, but I was ready." "I know," said Wren. "I saw." Tuck seemed to find this entirely sufficient, and looked back at the thimble with a settled, contented expression. The expression of someone who has done what they came to do and knows it. Moss reached out and touched the side of the thimble. Warm. Ready. He said. Tuck leaned forward and cupped both hands around it, feeling the warmth come through the brass, the chamomile smell rising up close and immediate. Eyes closed for a moment, then sat back, and Wren's arm came down slightly, and Tuck leaned into it. Lark was looking at the ceiling again. The same patch of ceiling as last night. The knot in the wood that looked like a sleeping face. "The valerian," Lark said. "Willa, what does it do exactly?" "It helps with sleep," said Willa. "It has a strong smell. Earthy. Some people find it unpleasant. And the passion flower. Calm. It quiets a busy mind. And the lemon balm." "Lark," said Wren, without opening her eyes. "I am only asking. You are listing every jar on the shelf." "I am interested in every jar on the shelf." "Lemon balm," said Willa, with the faint warmth of someone who does not mind being asked, "is for anxiety, for the kind of tiredness that cannot rest. It helps the body remember how to be still." Lark was quiet for a moment. "She has all of them," Lark said. "Every one of those things. Chamomile, valerian, passion flower, lemon balm. She keeps them all close." "Yes," said Willa. "Does she use them all?" "I think she uses what she needs," said Willa carefully. "On different nights." Lark thought about this. About Ada upstairs in her bed, in the dark. The shop below her full of things that helped people rest. The shelf in her kitchen holding the ones she kept closest. Drawing meadowsweet with extraordinary care. Making chamomile and forgetting to drink it. "She knows a great deal about rest," Lark said, "for someone who finds it difficult." The room was quiet for a moment. The candle flame leaned and straightened. "That is often how it is," said Willa. "The ones who understand something most deeply are sometimes the ones who have had to work hardest for it." Moss said nothing. He was looking at his hands on his knees, the familiar hands, the hands that had packed a screw hole with plaster dust at midnight in a cold kitchen so that a shelf would hold a little longer. He turned them over once, slowly, and looked at the palms, and then set them back on his knees. "Tuck," he said. Tuck looked up. "You asked me earlier when your hands would be ready." "You said soon," said Tuck. "I did." Moss looked at Tuck's hands. The small ones, the eager ones, the ones that had been pressed flat against the meadowsweet jar and ready to push when asked. "I think I may have been right," he said. Tuck looked at the hands again, with new consideration this time, as if they might have changed since the last looking. Wren's eyes were still closed, but the corner of her mouth moved very slightly, in a way that was not quite a smile, but was close enough. The candle burned lower. The thimble cooled slowly, the steam thinning to a thread, and then to nothing. The chamomile inside it, dark and still. The clock ticked in the sitting room, 2 rooms away, steady and slow, marking the deep hours of the night when Fernhollow was at its most quiet. When the lane outside was empty and the shop windows were dark, and the old oak on the village green stood in the moonlight with no one to see it but the moon. Willa had picked up her cord again. She was not working it, just holding it, the length of it looped through her fingers, feeling the texture of it in the way she felt the texture of most things, completely and without hurry. It was a good cord, fine and strong. She had found it 3 weeks ago, a length that had come loose from one of Ada's herb bundles and fallen behind the dresser, and she had known immediately that it would be useful for something. She did not yet know what, but she would. Moss's eyes were closed. His breathing had slowed. His hands loose on his knees now rather than folded, the fingers slightly open. He had the look of someone who had done what needed doing and had set it down completely, the way he set down his tools at the end of a task. Not with relief, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a kind of clean finality. The thing was done. The bracket held. The jars were safe. The meadowsweet was a full jar width from the edge. Lark had stopped looking at the ceiling and was looking at nothing in particular, the eyes half open, the thoughts moving slowly now, the questions quieting one by one, the way questions do when the body begins to insist on its own needs. Tuck was asleep, had been asleep for some time, the small head heavy against Wren's arm, the breathing slow and even and completely untroubled. The sleep of someone who had been ready to push when asked and had been seen being ready, and for whom that was enough, and more than enough, and everything. Wren sat with her eyes closed and her arm adjusted and her breathing slow. Not quite asleep, not quite awake, in the particular place between the two that she sometimes found on good nights. The place where the day was fully gone and the next day had not yet begun to press, where there was only the warmth of the room and the weight of Tuck against her arm, and the smell of chamomile cooling in the thimble, and the sound of the clock 2 rooms away ticking through the walls like a slow and steady heartbeat. Outside, Fernhollow was deep in its night. The lane was empty. The cold had settled fully now. A clean, still cold. The kind that came with clear skies and meant the stars were very bright above the rooftops, though none of them could see the stars from here. The old oak on the village green stood in the moonlight, its bare branches holding the cold air, its roots deep and wide beneath the frozen ground, going down and down into the dark earth where nothing rushed and nothing needed to. Ada slept above them. Her shelf held. Her jars sat in their new arrangement, the valerian in the center, the meadowsweet safe, the pale feathery flowers pressing gently against the glass in the dark kitchen, undisturbed, exactly where they needed to be. The candle flame leaned once, very slowly, and did not straighten this time. The light in the small room behind the baseboard softened and dimmed and became something closer to darkness than to light. A warm darkness, the kind that held rather than emptied. Moss breathed. Willa held her cord. Wren sat between sleeping and waking. Tuck slept without dreaming, or dreamed without knowing, which was perhaps the same thing. And Lark's eyes closed, finally, on the knot in the ceiling wood that looked like a sleeping face. And the last thought, not quite a question, not quite an answer, somewhere between the two, was of a shelf of small glass jars in a cold kitchen, and a woman who kept close the things that helped people rest, and the meadowsweet drawing with its flowers at every stage of opening, and how it was that some people understood the most about the things they had to work hardest for. And then that thought, too, went quiet, and the room was still. And in the warm house above the herbalist shop, in the village of Fernhollow, the Tidwells slept.